Good morning. We are in the book of Hebrews, and we are continuing in our study there, and I hope that it is an encouragement to us. It was meant to be an encouragement to those that heard originally, and I hope that it is an encouragement even to us today. As I think about things and about how the writer is continuing in chapter 4, I'm reminded of some things that I do to my kids, and I hope that it's not too infuriating, but I love to play word games. And especially with words that have more than one meaning, I like to take what they're saying and kind of move in an entirely different direction and just go with it. It infuriates my wife sometimes, who speaks like 4 different languages. And so sometimes it gets a little bit difficult there. But they might be talking about something, and that's what I do. And I think that this comes from kind of my dad. My dad is a word player. He loves puns and things like that. So when he would drop us off somewhere, he would say, "Bye now." And then he would follow it up with, "Pay later." And you just kind of did it. You just kind of rolled with it. That's how it was. And it was just part of everything that we did and everything that we were doing. So we were not too quick to answer what, to all intents and purposes, might sound like a simple grammatical or vocabulary question with my dad, because it was often like a trick question. So you might ask, well, what's the opposite of fast? Well, obviously slow, right? Well, maybe it's feast. So you take a look at that and you wonder exactly how all that plays out, and it kind of makes you aware of words and how things are working. Biblical authors take words and do some amazing things with them, and by doing so, they get us to think. They take a look at words, and they try to figure out exactly what's going on, and they suck the meaning out of it. They infuse it with meaning. They use metaphors and similes, rhymes and rhythms. They use chiastic and parallel structures, and they use unique phraseology to get through a point, and they infuse vocabulary with meaning to mean something that it may not have meant in the past. And they do that by building a context around it and doing all sorts of things. And really what we have here in chapter 4, we have our author here in Hebrews chapter 4 taking the word rest, and which really starts in chapter 3, and he infuses it with meaning, and he uses it in the wholeness of the concept, making sure that we understand exactly the fullness of the rest that we can expect in Jesus Christ. And he's wanting us to understand the fullness of it so that we can feel the longing, I believe, that we should all have for God's rest, for what he is doing there. And so you can consider rest, for example, when we take a look at the idea of, I got the wrong one. Finished. I got them out of order, Melissa. I'm sorry. So anyway, I finally got the PowerPoint, though, and I'm very happy about that, because I was thinking I was losing my mind there. But when we take a look at rest, and we think about the rest that we experience when we finish a job, and maybe you're a little like me, but if I can figure out a way to do it, I'm going to do it. It's kind of like, why in the world would I send it out, or why in the world would I get somebody else to do it when I can do it? And I am a great YouTube jack of all trades. If I can look it up on YouTube and figure out how to do it, that's fine. So I'll fiddle with a car, or I'll fiddle with a tractor, or I'll fiddle with some electricity in the house, carefully. Plumbing, whatever else, I'll try to figure it out. And if I think I've got a handle on it, I'll do it. If I watch the video and I go, I have no idea what in the world they're talking about, I'll defer to an expert and I'll try to find out. Sometimes when I get into the middle of a situation and I am working through it, and I've replayed minute 20 of YouTube several times to make sure that I'm doing the job right, I can assure you that sometimes I feel like, okay, why in the world did I ever start this? I'm not exactly sure why in the world I got into this. And I might regret it a little bit. But after it's finished, I usually have a sense of accomplishment. And I'll call my wife in and say, "Hey, look what I did." And it feels good. And we can say it's finished. My wife is currently creating a rock garden. And she is taking rocks from everybody who will give her any kind of rock. Don't send us any rocks. I think we have enough. But she's taking rocks from whomever she can find it. So two doors down, a guy had a pile of rocks and said, "Sure, you take as many as you want." And so she has been hauling these rocks back and forth, getting things done. She has been dreaming about this rock garden for absolutely decades. And I think that as she is creating this, it's recreative in her own mind. It's actually creating, it's recreating, it's getting those juices flowing as she's doing the project. She's taking joy in actually doing the project. But I tell you what, the goal is to have a finished product. The goal is to do that, and it will be done. And when it is finally done, she'll look at it and she'll say, this is good. I'm going to take a look at, we're going to read Hebrews chapter 4. We should have done that earlier, but I'm going to take a look at Hebrews chapter 4, and I'm going to read this, and we're going to see how all this kind of applies. It says, therefore, since we have the promise of entering his rest, as that still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we have also had the gospel preached to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because those who heard it did not combine it with faith. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said. So I declared in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his work has been finished. And this is what we're talking about, this finished, since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, and on the seventh day God rested from all his work. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest. And those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of their disobedience. Therefore God again set a certain day, calling it today, when a long time later he spoke through David. As it was said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall by following their example of disobedience. And so we have this idea really that there is a finishing here. And if it does sound Genesis-like, as we take a look in chapter 4, it is certainly Genesis-like. We take a look, we take part in God's God-given work and doing what God wants us to do. If we're talking about pre-fall, we're talking something Adam-like, where he was actually given a job to do. If we take a look at the passage, what we find is that God set him in the garden and said, I want you to work the garden. And there was a recreative process in all of that. We take part in God's work in this way. We are fulfilling that. And I suspect that the rest from that work was always going to be a part of the rhythm that God had in mind for his creation. The idea that things get finished. And we, like God, could step back and say, that's good. And that's what God did on the Sabbath, isn't it? After he took a look at creation and after he took a look at everything that was going on, he stepped back and he said, it is good. And he created man and he said, it is very good. And on the seventh day, he rested. We see that here in Hebrews. Our writer is using this word rest, and he's talking about finished. But he's also talking about relief. Because unfortunately there is sin, and that changes the entire dynamic. And this is where our author steeps the concept of rest in an absolute different reality. God told Adam and Eve that because of their disobedience, they would toil in their work and meet with difficulty. It was not going to be as easy as it was in the past. Even as God went back to work to redeem us and is continuing to work, in John 5:17 we find Jesus talking about God in that particular thing. He says, God has been working and is working even to this day. So we see that what God did is he takes on the work of redemption. Again, he is taking on that. Yes, he created, and now because of the fall, he is recreating people through Jesus Christ. He is involved in that work. We now take part in that work as his redeemed. But pain and suffering becomes part of the equation. And in Genesis chapter 3, it says that the ground is cursed and there are thorns and there are thistles that spring up. And in Luke 8, 1 through 15, Jesus talks about the different types of soil that are available to those people who hear the word. And we, as workers of God, as people who are now promoting the gospel of Christ, we meet with those different types of soil. Some of them are rocky, and some of them are thorny, and some of them have absolutely nothing that allows them to take root, or it gets choked out in all this. And more often than not, because of our fallen condition, our best efforts produce results that are disappointing. I want us to get this very clear in our heads. The temptation here, for those people who are getting this book originally, and those of us who are here today, the temptation has always been to give up. The work is just plain too hard. And we understand that in a sense when we talk about our actual work that we do. Maybe sometimes there's certain days that are really good and we're saying, okay, well that was productive and I got a lot done. And there are other days when we look and go, oh, do I really have to go into work today? We understand that in that sense, but in our spiritual sense, as we take a look at somehow working against a world that does not want to hear the gospel, working against a world that wants to belittle everything that we stand for, working against a world that wants to say that what you are believing in is not true, the temptation is always to give up. And so to our beat up and worn out souls, God says through the writer of Hebrews, I have a day of rest for you. I have a day of rest for you. It's not just a matter of looking back at the job you finished and saying it is good. It is a matter of crawling into the arms of the Father, really. And having all the pain in our hardships wiped away, as it says in Revelation 21, 3 and 4. We will look back at these times, even in these times of struggle, and we'll say, it is good, it was all worth it, if we enter that rest. We need that. We need that. I don't know what things you involve yourself in. I don't know what you do. For some reason, I enjoy running. I do. I know that there are some of you here who enjoy running. There are times when I am running along and I'm thinking, okay, I'm on mile 2.5 and I've got another mile to go, and maybe I'll just walk the rest of it. Or maybe I'll just sit here on the side of the road and wait for somebody to pick me up. But what keeps me going is there's a goal. There's rest at the end. And so keep on putting one foot in front of the other. Keep on moving. Keep on going. And when you get to the end, then that's the rest. And you can look back and say, it wasn't fun this time. And it wasn't good. It is finished. But it is a relief. And we have all of that. I believe that in a real sense, our longing for such rest moves forward and back in time and space, especially if we have known something of rest in our past. And I think that for most of us, it moves toward a place called home. And I think that our author also has this in mind when he speaks of rest. I'm going too ahead. It's a place of security where our needs are met and the worry is the furthest thing from our mind. I don't think that I am unusual in this, but sometimes when things are going badly or things are tough or when I'm tired or whatever else, I will find myself saying things like, I want to go home. And it just springs out. I want to go home. And if I really think about it in that particular moment, I'm often surprised by what I mean. Because it's just a knee-jerk thing. I want to go home. But if I explore it and think about it, I may mean where I currently live, where there is love, and there is peace, and there is rest. I may mean where I grew up, and what I mean by that, I may mean New Jersey. I think that's unusual for most people in the country to say I want to go home and have it mean New Jersey. But sometimes I think about that. It was a place where there were no cares or any troubles or anything like that. I didn't have any responsibilities or anything like that. But I also may mean my grandparents' house. And what I'm really saying is I want to go somewhere where the cares of this world don't exist. We all know that they existed. We were just unaware of them. At my grandmother's funeral back in 2018, I said this: heaven to me could very well be an upper unheated attic room at her house with ice on the window panes and beds full of cousins under 5 blankets with the smell of biscuits and bacon wafting through the floor grate. Could easily be that. For the Israelites, it was to be the promised land, as in chapter 4:6 talks about. And I think that it is interesting as we take a look at chapter 4, 6, and even as we take a look at what is going on in chapter 4, 2. I want us to hear this very carefully. It says, "For we also have had the gospel preached to us just as they did." Who is he talking about? He's talking about the Israelites before they entered the promised land. And yet they had the gospel preached to them. Do we understand this? Do we see this? We see this in 4:6 again. It still remains that some will enter that rest, and those who formerly had the gospel preached to them, as those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of their disobedience. Talk about a wordsmith in our author. We understand the gospel message. We understand that we are talking about salvation. Those who had the gospel preached to them before they entered the promised land understood the good news of having a place to go. Home. Security. What they needed. It was all done. Putting it all together and thinking about home, thinking about relief, thinking about it is finished, thinking about all those things. In a real sense, if we are taking part in the one who was and is to come, as Revelation talks about, Jesus, the one who is, was, and is to come, we should not be surprised at this merger of time and space. And I don't want to get all physics on this or anything like that. But I think that there really is something on this. I think that there is a confluence. I think that we have a foretaste of that glory divine as the song talks about. I think that we can talk about Romans where he says he has poured this love in our hearts, and that gives us hope. Hope for a future. We understand that we experience something now that is akin to that rest. We understand something about this concept. We understand what is going on because God has given us these things. And so our author takes all of this, he falls right into this confluence of time and space and sums up everything in one word, and we've already spoken of this word. He speaks of it in the word today. We see this in verse 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And so every good thing that we have had, a promised land, a safe and secure home, anything that we have ever experienced in terms of rest is brought to this moment as a time of decision. And every good thing that awaits us is packed into the now as a promise. To put an exclamation point on it, our author clarifies, the promised land was good news, but it was not the final rest, it was just the hors d'oeuvre. That's where we are. We are in that sense, and I know, and I sense, and I realize, and I understand that when Jesus, and we talked about this, my burden is light, my yoke is light. When he's talking about those types of things, we understand that when we have come to Jesus, there is a certain amount of rest that we now feel in our souls. It is that hors d'oeuvre, so to speak. It is that thing that we understand and we feel on that small level, but we understand that what is coming on is even greater than what we have now. We sense that. But the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand that there still is a real and present danger. Because the work of faith is really hard. If we take a look at what is going on in this passage, we have these Israelites who were not able to enter the promised land because of their lack of faith. They did not believe that God would give them the land. They did not believe it. True confession time. There are times when the place and the time that God has promised me seems almost too far-fetched for me to believe. If that's shocking to you, I can't imagine that it can be, because I don't know a person who hasn't experienced that. The people in the book of Hebrews felt that. Is it really as good as God is promising? Is it really as wonderful? Is it really that restful? Can't I just give up now and take a little bit of rest right now? Can I just give up trying to do the right thing? Can I stop fighting this fight it. And God says, there's rest. Just a little further. Just a little further. Our author is pleading with us, begging us to believe it, and in believing, in living it. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall by following their example of disobedience. There is rest. There is salvation. All the good things that God has spoken are true. And we know it. And if this is the day that you've decided that you want to take a little taste of that rest, we beg you to become part of Jesus' body. To take on his yoke and his burden, because it's light. And to walk in a new life. And so if this is the day that you've decided that you want to become a Christian, by obeying Jesus Christ and putting on your Lord and Savior in the waters of baptism, don't hesitate. Start on that journey of rest. Come as we stand and sing.